Well, if you've been following the news in the last little bit, you'll understand that Yevgheny Prigozhin, the head and the chief financier of the mercenary group Wagner in Russia, had himself quite a week, particularly last weekend. But it wasn't just the weekend, he's still having himself a week, and I would think that his future isn't as solid as he might hope that it was. But anyways, let's get back to last weekend and what happened to start all this off. And I shouldn't really say it's what started it all off, because it really had its genesis a little earlier in the relationship that Prigozhin has with the top of the military structure in Russia. And that particularly would be the conflict that he has with the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, who is not a military man, never served in the army. He's a political hack. And the other fellow who's a real general, that would be the chief of the general staff, General Valery Gerasimov. Now, Prigozhin has had a problem with both of these guys ever since Russia walked into Ukraine. Wagner, which is an independent military group, now mind you, it's financed by the Russians. The relationship between the two is rather murky, but there is a definite connection between Russia itself, or Putin himself, and the Wagner group. Remember that Prigozhin used to be one of Putin's loyal subordinates, and one of the guys who got himself fabulously wealthy as a result of Putin's hold on power in Russia. So, what went wrong? Wagner has been one of the most effective fighting forces for the Russians in Ukraine, and that's to say something, because the Russians haven't been very effective at all. Basically, they've been getting their ass kicked ever since they set foot in Ukraine. But some silver lining is there, and that's the response of Wagner, particularly in the area of Bakhmut. Bakhmut, by itself, it's a city in Ukraine, but it's not really terribly strategic for any particular reason. But it sort of developed into a modern-day Stalingrad, where both sides went at it hammer and tong in this city for the longest time, for months and months and months. Until finally Wagner was able to take control of the city proper. Now that doesn't mean that they took the entire Bakhmut area, but they were able to grab the urban area after months and months and months of heavy fighting and taking tens of thousands of casualties in the process. Well, during all of this, Prigozhin got into a big argument with Shoigu in particular, and Gerasimov as well, over the supply of ammunition and arms to Wagner from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Now, Prigozhin had accused those two of trying to undermine Wagner by failing to give the mercenaries the kind of weaponry and, of course, the volume of ammunition that they needed in their fight against the Ukrainians in Bakhmut. And so Prigozhin started to get the idea in his mind, it started kicking around in the back of his head, that these two guys, possibly even at the behest of Putin himself, were undertaking a campaign to not only undermine Wagner, but to possibly even in the long term destroy Wagner, given that Wagner is a battle-hardened force. I mean, the total number of Wagner mercenaries worldwide is somewhere in the area of 70 to 80,000 men. They've been involved in Africa, they were involved in Syria, and they've been involved, of course, in Ukraine. And they have emerged as being some of the Russians' best troops in that conflict with Ukraine. So they are viewed somewhat suspiciously by the Russian military. They are viewed, I mean, listen, they're an armed force independent of the Russian military, possibly with connections to Putin himself, possibly with connections to the Siloviki, which of course is the Russian elite. So for the Ministry of Defense or for any other interior security forces that exist in Russia, Wagner represents a sort of threat to them and to the overall stability of Putin's regime. So Prigozhin was very suspicious that these guys were getting together to have conversations to see about diminishing Wagner or defeating it outright and eliminating it as a possible threat. So Prigozhin has been extremely negative in his commentary. He has been saying stuff about the Russian war effort, and in particular the Ministry of Defense, that would, I mean, a regular Russian on the street, questioning the validity of the war in the first place could find themselves in jail for 15 years, and I'm not kidding there. And yet Prigozhin is saying stuff that's almost bordering on treason, if you look at it. And, you know, as time will go by, you will see Putin actually accuse him of treason without mentioning his name, mind you, but still it's unmistakable who Putin is talking about. Okay, so nevertheless, Prigozhin has these profanity-laden criticisms of Shoigu and Gerasimov and senior Russian military commanders, accusing them of corruption, accusing them of incompetence, criticizing them and leveling charges that they don't know what they're doing, and that they gave misleading advice to Putin himself prior to the invasion that made Putin think that when the Russians walked into Ukraine that they were going to be met with Ukrainians lining the sides of the road, throwing flowers and just being exultant at the appearance of Russian troops to save them from the Nazism of the Ukrainian regime of Vladimir Zelensky. But as the Russians found out very soon after they entered Ukraine, that was the exact opposite of the reception that they got. The Ukrainians dug in, they fought back, and mind you, this was before the West started feeding them large amounts of military equipment, ammunition, and so forth. So the Ukrainians really dug in, and they managed to roll things back and actually turn the Russians back and take back some of the territory, not all, mind you, but some of the territory that the Russians had taken in the early going of the invasion. So, Prigozhin is, as I said, he was accusing the Russian military of providing Putin with information that perhaps he was more likely wanting to hear. From what I understand of Putin's leadership style, he's the kind of guy that really doesn't want to listen to you if you have any kind of advice or views or information that sort of runs contrary to what he already thinks. And so what that leads to is a situation where, he's not making decisions based upon valid military intelligence and overall intelligence. He's making decisions based upon results that he's already formulated in his mind that already fit his preconceived narrative of the way things should go in Ukraine. So, Prigozhin, this past weekend, I think it was around Friday, it must have been Friday, and he got it into his head that Gerasimov and Shoigu had a meeting together, and as a result of that meeting, they agreed to collaborate together to try and bring about the demise of Wagner. So at the end of the meeting, so thought Prigozhin, and perhaps he's correct, Gerasimov undertook to use Russian aviation and Russian artillery to hit Wagner columns as they extricated themselves from the front. The fight for Bakhmut is over, so Wagner was being brought back to the rear for rest and refit. Supposedly, that's the way real militaries work. And it was determined as a result of this meeting, in Prigozhin's opinion, it was decided that they were going to catch Wagner while they were vulnerable, and to hit them with artillery and aviation and those sorts of things. So that got up Prigozhin's butt a little bit, understandably, to be attacked by friendly fire. And so he decided to take matters into his own hands here. I mean, all the criticism over all of the months that never led to anything. Putin never did anything about this criticism towards Shoigu and Gerasimov. It really must have made those two feel that they were just sort of twisting in the wind, not really having the support of Putin, at least publicly, in the face of the criticism from Prigozhin. So, and that's the way Putin plays his game. He sort of got a little Joseph Stalin in him. Just Stalin used to pit all his generals against one another to see who would emerge the strongest or who would survive that exercise. So he would always have a little bit of a competition, and he'd stand back and watch them sort of fight with each other to see who would get the table scraps off Stalin's table. So Putin, who sort of imagines himself as one of these great historical Russian figures himself, plays that game as well. So he never offered any public, anyways, criticism of Prigozhin's contents, and it must have made Shoigu and Gerasimov feel very vulnerable indeed. Remember, this is Russia, where you never know. This is Russia, where stabbing somebody in the back is just another phrase that is Saturday night. That's something that it's almost a cultural thing for them over there. But anyways, it couldn't have made Shoigu and Gerasimov feel very secure about their positions. So back to Prigozhin and last weekend. So what does he do in the face of these attacks that allegedly took place on his fighters from the Russian military? So what he does is he gathers about 25,000 of his men, and he crosses the border from Ukraine into Russia. So, I mean, to all intents and purposes, this is an invasion of Russia. Now, mind you, there's no 25,000 soldiers ever made that are going to walk into Russia and occupy the place. It's just not going to happen. But 25,000 soldiers is enough to march on the next nearest Russian city of any note, and that would be Rostov-on-Don, which just happens to be the command and control center of the entire Russian military effort in Ukraine. So Prigozhin rolls in on Rostov-on-Don, and he is met with absolutely zero resistance. There is nothing. They take Rostov-on-Don without a shot. In fact, the citizens of the place are lining the streets, and they're waving and hooting and hollering and taking pictures and taking selfies with Wagner mercenaries, taking pictures with Prigozhin himself, who has become rather a populist against the elites of Russia, of which Gerasimov and Shoigu would be considered to be members of. So what an embarrassing situation for the Kremlin. I mean, it's like a stab in the back from one of their own. They never really considered that Prigozhin would do something like this in an attempt I suppose his attempt is to try and get Shoigu and Gerasimov sacked, to get them replaced. He said it wasn't an invasion. He said it was a march of justice. And I guess that's the justice he's looking for, not to cause problems for Putin, not to overthrow Putin's regime, but to force Putin to get rid of Shoigu and Gerasimov. So, as I said, he walks into Rostov-on-Don. Very embarrassing for the Russians generally. Very embarrassing for Vladimir Putin specifically. So, that's Friday night. And then we get into Saturday, and then we start hearing news reports of Wagner forces being in another larger Russian city, Voronezh, which is up the M4 highway from Rostov-on-Don and roughly about halfway between Rostov-on-Don and Moscow itself, which is the capital city of Russia and the home of the Kremlin, as you know. And again, it's the same story. Wagner just rolls into Voronezh without any opposition. And they roll in and they take the place, and if it was embarrassing before, it's humiliating now, because the Russians don't have anything to stop them. All of the Russian forces are in Ukraine, getting their asses kicked. There's nothing but grandpas and babushkas that stand in the way of Wagner here, and even some Russian military units and police units that were sent to oppose Wagner either took off at the approach of Wagner. Some of them may have joined Wagner, but they didn't get in the way and exchange too much combat power with Wagner. I guess survival is a pretty keen instinct in Russia, and these guys knew that the situation wasn't really good to stand their ground, so they melted away fairly quickly and fairly easily. So now Wagner forces are in Voronezh, and So that's all well and good. I mean, they're only measured in a couple dozen thousands. Like I said, it's not like they're going to take Russia or anything, but they're causing quite a stir, and the stir is mostly as a result of the Russians can do nothing to stop them. So then we start hearing news reports of Wagner columns of heavy equipment and troops and trucks and armored personnel carriers and anti-aircraft systems and artillery systems and the whole whack of it rolling up the M4 highway towards Moscow itself. And these guys get to within about 150 miles of Moscow. Now, it's been a long time since a hostile military force has approached Moscow. The last time I can remember was in the failed coup of 1991. And then prior to that, I think I have to go all the way back to 1941 when Hitler made it to within the last subway stop of the Russian subway system, where he could actually see Red Square off in the distance. Not Hitler himself, but the German troops that were the leading element of the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Kremlin and Moscow generally has not been in this level of panic since those two events. Okay, so there's orders that go out to blow up the roads, to send heavy equipment to dig up the roads, to impede the progress of Wagner as they use these roads, to put anti-tank ditches around Moscow, to do the very best that they can to offer up obstacles to get in the way of Wagner, because they're obviously afraid that Wagner's going to roll right into Moscow itself. So this level of panic is very noteworthy, and as I said before, there's no 25,000 guys, and this column of Wagner guys doesn't have 25,000 guys. It's just part of the 25,000. So it might even be in the area of 5,000 guys. So there's no 5,000 guys who are going to walk into Moscow, a city of several million people, and take over anything, much less a McDonald's. But even that's impossible because McDonald's bugged out of the country at the start of the war. So it would be more symbolic than anything else. So I suppose Prigozhin probably thought that he had support from some powerful elements in Russian society. Perhaps members of the Siloviki, which of course he is a member of. That's an organization or a group of people who represent the elites of Russia, of which Putin would be considered to be the top dog. Maybe he thought that some of those people were going to rally to his colors. Maybe he thought that there were some Russian military units that were going to join him along the way to Moscow. I mean, maybe he thought of himself as a modern-day Napoleon. If you recall, Napoleon was exiled on Elba, an island, after all the problems that he caused in Europe in the years previous. But he got a little antsy and he decided he was going to make a big comeback. And he showed up on the shores of southern France with his ragtag grouping of supporters, and the entire French army was sitting there waiting for him. And he addresses them, and the next thing you know, the entire French army switches sides and joins Napoleon against their king, which they swore an oath of loyalty to. And that worked out just fine for Napoleon, who marched all the way to Paris and took power. And that lasted until the Battle of Waterloo, which kind of settled the Napoleon thing once and for all. Anyways, back to Prigozhin. He probably thought that was going to happen with him, where people were just going to join him, and together they were en masse going to move towards the capital and force some changes, perhaps in the Kremlin itself, but certainly to leverage some changes to get Shoigu and Gerasimov sacked by Putin himself. So it didn't work out all that well. As Saturday turned to Sunday, then the news reports started to report that the Wagner column had stopped. In fact, it had more than stopped, it had turned around. So, what's going on here? I mean, we over in the West, or I'll speak for myself, we're sitting here actually, I have no love for Yevgheny Prigozhin, but I'm sitting here like, yeah, if I have to take a side, I'm going to be cheering for him. If he causes any discomfort or any problems or any panic or any negativity whatsoever in the Russian leadership, I say, good for you. You may be a detestable war criminal, but if I had a choice between a group of detestable war criminals, well, right now I'm cheering for you. In the end, I hope you all end up losers. But yeah, I mean, as the Russians are fighting amongst themselves, can't be anything but good news for the rest of us. Now, let's stop for a second and think about the Ukrainian soldier who's got his ass in a trench somewhere on the Ukrainian front lines, and looking around. And I mean, he already knows that the Russian military is corrupt and incompetent, and he already knows that he's been placed there really just as they refer to it as cannon fodder. He's just a body, an expendable body. And you know, the Russian command and control structure is top down, meaning that any decisions that are made in the field by military commanders have to be made by commanders that are well up the chain of command. The Russians don't have any non-commissioned officers in their military. I don't know why, because they're incompetent. They don't know what they're doing. So they don't have any sergeants, they don't have any corporals, they don't have anybody on site in a battle or in the field that can make a decision to react to events that are happening right in front of them. Instead, they've got to kick that, like I said, upstairs. There's no Russian officer that's going to make a decision, because if it goes south on him, then he is at risk of demotion. He's at risk of arrest and detention. He's at risk of execution. This is Russia, friends. Yes, it happens still. It's always happened. It probably always will happen. It's just the nature of the beast. So, if that doesn't handcuff Russian forces to begin with, as I said, Prigozhin had taken Rostov-on-Don, which was the headquarters for the command and control of the Russian military effort in Ukraine. And so now they don't have any connection with headquarters. So the Russian soldier sitting in the trench, he has no idea what's happening behind him in the rear, and he has no idea what's happening in front of him at the front. And so you're sitting there and you're wondering, okay, what's going on here, and why am I sitting here getting prepared to die? You know, the Ukrainians are broadcasting over loudspeakers to the Russians, this is not your fight. What are you doing here? Why did you come here to die? Your problem isn't with us or Kiev. Your problem is your own country, Russia, and the leadership in Moscow. They're the people who dragged you away from your family and stuck you in this muddy trench with no training, inadequate food, inadequate ammunition, and just basically put you in a position where they were going to hang you out to dry. And if you tried to do anything about it, if you tried to withdraw in the face of the enemy, the Russians have barrier troops behind you in a second line whose job it is to mow you down with machine gun fire if you ever get it into your head that things are a little bit tough and you better withdraw. No, sir. There will be no withdrawing from the front line. You're there and you've got one purpose, and that is to lay down your life for the Rodina, or the motherland, and in particular for its leader, Vladimir Putin. So, you know, this has to have a negative effect when Russians see that the chaos that's being caused by Prigozhin in Russia is being not met with anything. And we have to remember too, like about 2 or 3 weeks ago, remember those Russian rebels, I suppose? They were all outfitted by Ukraine with Ukrainian equipment, but they ran across the border and shot the place up. At the Russian oblasts that are right across the border from Ukraine. I'm thinking of Belgorod Oblast and Belgorod, the city itself, which is fairly close to the Ukrainian border. So these Russian partisan units, all kitted out in Ukrainian kit or equipment, come across the border, and they're met with absolutely nothing. And any opposition that did rise to the occasion was quickly pushed aside by these guys. And like I said, they sort of shot the place up and they rolled back over the border into Ukraine, leaving the Russians looking stupid and incompetent, and that they can't meet the security requirements of defending their own border. But again, the entire Russian military is in Ukraine. What's left they weren't thinking that anything like this was going to happen from their own people. So Vladimir Putin is looking extremely weak as a result of this, and that doesn't sit well with Vladimir at all. Vladimir likes to project himself as a strong man, a virile man, a vital man. Remember, this is a guy who wrestles bears and alligators, without a shirt on. He's just very robust. He's the best hockey player in all of Russia. And if you don't believe me, watch some of the video of this clown playing hockey. I remember there was a video there, I'm digressing here, but he scored 9 goals in this one hockey game. It was just absolutely brilliant. Watch the video of Putin's triple hat trick there, and you'll see what a freaking joke Russia is. And they must think that we're all stupid when and they do believe that all Russians are stupid enough to believe this stuff. And you know what? They're not far off the mark. I don't wish to be overly critical of Russians in general, but there's something about these people in their culture even where, lying, cheating, murdering, misrepresentation is just like another day. It's just what you do. It's just what's expected. So I don't mean to sound racist against Russians, but they are very frustrating people. They don't understand what democracy is, and even when they have a chance to have it, it's like they've got it in their hands and they're going, "What is this? What do I do with this?" They just can't handle it. And so because they can't handle it, they're so used to having a strong man leading them, even if that man is repressive and an autocrat and a kleptocrat that's stealing from them blindly and is directly responsible for their less than perfect quality of life. Even with all of that, they're prepared to pay that price, so long as they've got a strong man to protect them. What they need is somebody to protect them from the strong man, but they just haven't scraped together the brain cells to figure that out just yet. Anyways, my apologies to any of you who may be Russian, but if any of you out there who are Russian, you may not like what I'm saying, but you don't have to reflect too hard to understand that I'm not too far off the mark there. But anyways, so Wagner is now moving back because, the hope for outpouring of support that I guess Prigozhin was hoping for never materialized. So he kind of went, okay, we got a problem here. I've sort of hung myself out to dry. I've made it look like I was going to move into Moscow. I've already moved into 2 other major Russian cities. I've already made the Russians look like complete hapless fools. It makes the Russians look like the freaking Keystone Cops, which is a fair comparison in my mind. But anyways, I guess he figured, okay, this isn't going so well, so what am I going to do now? So into the picture marches our savior. And who is that? That is the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, who is known, he's known in Western Europe as the longest serving autocrat or dictator in Europe. I guess you're not really paying attention to Putin over in Russia, but anyways, Lukashenko, that's who he's viewed as. But basically, Lukashenko's claim to fame is that he is so far up Putin's backside that it hurts to say that. But it's true. Lukashenko is basically a puppet of Putin who owes his position in power to Putin, who supported him while the Belarus people, the Belarusians, rose up against Lukashenko back in 2020. And the Russians helped him out, and so he owes them a few favors. He's not that stupid of a guy. He realizes that basically Putin's goal is to incorporate Belarus into Russia itself. And he's sort of trying to, he's smart enough to recognize that and try and sort of not make that happen, because he understands that the moment that happens, he's just a puppet. What he doesn't realize is he's already a puppet. But anyways, I'm going to connect them back to our story here. So in walks Lukashenko, who knows Prigozhin, and he knows Putin. So in walks Lukashenko. He knows Prigozhin fairly well. He, of course, knows Putin very well. And so I guess he fancies himself as a middleman here who could offer his services in mediation. Now, mind you, I think probably Putin put him up to it. But nevertheless, whatever the reason, Lukashenko is now the man of the hour. And so as a result of negotiating between the two parties, Putin, by the way, when at the approach of the Wagner mercenaries up Highway M4, Putin was so confident of the ability of his tattered forces to stop Wagner that he bugged out to St. Petersburg. So that tells you an awful lot about the man who wrestles alligators and bears and stuff like that. Yeah, he took off. He didn't want to hang around and be embarrassed any further than he had to be. With Putin, it's all about saving himself. And if there is going to be any blame, if anybody is going to have a finger pointed at them, it will not be him. It will be him pointing the finger at underlings. Putin's not the kind of guy that feels he looks good under the wheels of a bus, but he doesn't mind throwing other people there. So as a result, Prigozhin realizes that the gig's kind of up. He still has thousands of armed men within Russia that the Russians can't really do anything about, but he's sort of in a spot here. So Lukashenko brokers a deal whereby Prigozhin would be granted exile in Belarus. He would be allowed to be joined there by any of his Wagner soldiers that choose to follow him there. He will have to give up his equipment to the Russian military or the Ministry of Defense. And all charges that had been leveled against him by the Russian Security Service, the FSB, would be dropped. So essentially, the deal is from that side that Putin, or Prigozhin rather, will be given safe passage to Belarus, and Putin gave his personal assurance that no harm will visit Prigozhin while he is in Belarus. Yeah, right. Anyways, so we don't know what the flip side of this bargain is. We don't know what Prigozhin got out of it, except for the safe assurances of exile in Belarus, which doesn't sound really attractive to me, but where the hell's a guy like that going to go, right? Yeah, I mean, are Shoigu and Gerasimov going to be sacked? Is Putin going to humiliate himself by cashiering two of his most loyal lieutenants? Not that they're lieutenants, Gerasimov's a general, but like two of his most loyal cohorts, because that would be absolutely humiliating. And for last weekend, I would think that Putin's not used to being embarrassed, much less humiliated. With the weekend that he's having, I don't really see him being too conducive to another continued humiliation here. But and as far as I know, both those gentlemen are still in their jobs. But maybe Putin's sort of hanging back and waiting for a little bit of time to pass rather, before he gets rid of these guys, so that it looks like it had nothing to do with what Prigozhin demanded. Anyways, we're not terribly sure about what the other side of the deal is. So we'll have to keep our eyes on the status of Shoigu and Gerasimov, who in the past week have been videotaped sitting in a helicopter together, looking out the window and pointing out the window and nodding and all that kind of bullshit. Because those guys have no idea what the hell they're doing anyways, particularly Shoigu. It's all a complete sham. And we don't even know if that video was taken in the last week. That could have been taken last year, the year before last year. I mean, you never know. The Russians and the truth are two things that just really don't walk hand in hand, and they never have. So that's where we are right now. So the whole idea, you've got the Russians, they're in absolute tatters. Putin's reputation is, of course, badly damaged as a result of all of this. Shoigu and Gerasimov have, I guess what you can charitably say, as uncertain futures, and you can bet that the knives in the Kremlin, in the back rooms of the Kremlin, are being sharpened. Listen, guys like Shoigu, Gerasimov, maybe even Putin himself, Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesperson, the foreign minister Sergei Lavrov, the whole whack of them. It wouldn't be surprising if they're all dead within a year, and probably with Russians killing them. So things are rough. Now, meanwhile, Prigozhin in exile in Belarus, that's just nothing short of a complete joke. I mean, come on. Belarus, as I said, is almost part of Russia as it certainly stands right now. So honestly, I don't really care what assurances Putin may have given Prigozhin about his safety. Lying is a fact of life. I wouldn't trust that one iota. And I'm sure Prigozhin doesn't. So those assurances, they're not worth a flea-ridden bowl of borscht, in my opinion. Don't be surprised if Yevgeny Prigozhin mysteriously falls out of a fourth floor window or higher. Don't be surprised if the cigar he's smoking, I don't know if he smokes cigars, but if he does, don't be surprised if it explodes in his face. Don't be surprised if he falls grievously ill from ingesting some polonium-riddled food. Polonium being, of course, the radioactive poison of choice for Russian assassins. They've used it before. They'll use it again. That's what they used on Navalny. That's what they've used on other dissenters of the Russian regime. So, if I was Prigozhin, I would be watching my back, and I'm sure he is. And so if like I said, if I was him, which I'm really glad that I'm not, I would be investing heavily in a crackerjack security unit to protect me. The Russians have a long history of following people to other countries and assassinating them or killing them. It's what they do. It's what they do. And even that security detail may not be enough for Prigozhin. We got used to watching North American soap operas because they're on all the time and they're ubiquitous. They're always there. They always provide entertainment. But after a while, they kind of get a little long on the tooth. So, people started gravitating towards British soap operas. And of course, Coronation Street has a huge following here in Canada in particular. But now we've got the best. We've got the Red Square Blues, a Russian soap opera. And we can't get enough of that. I'm telling you, television has never been better. For Newsmag Renfrew, I'm Steve Jones. Slava Ukraini!